once I realized that I wasn't the right kind of Black, for lack of a better term, I was very fascinated by, you know, where people were coming from ideologically, where I was coming from ideologically, and why they were bumping together, right, and not coalescing.
I think life is way more interesting and challenging and fruitful when we're around diversity of opinion. The other thing is, and this is my academic side, I think it's the best way to improve ourselves as human beings, and especially to find out what's true and what isn't. Being around people that agree with you turns out to be a very bad way to discover truth. In fact, it works the opposite, right? It creates groupthink. There's a reason we call it that. Things the pollsters have taught us is that the more formal education you have in this country, the less likely you are to report having conversations with people of a different political ideology than yourself. In other words, education does precisely the opposite of the story that we tell about it.
It's incredibly challenging. I can speak from personal experience for high school students to kind of wrap their heads around it. But I don't think they will be in a position to kind of innovate and develop enduring solutions if they don't go through that process of exposing themselves to viewpoint diversity. And similar to Jonathan, like I kind of firmly believe, or have come to believe, in what Mill says in terms of, you know, rhetoric and argument. If you only know your side of the argument, you know little of that. So from a rhetorical standpoint, there is value to testing your own personal arguments and kind of working through the contrast or the conflict that comes up and kind of testing those against others. And that helps you strengthen your own point of view.
The reason why I'm into viewpoint diversity is because well, two reasons. The first is I'm not a big fan of essentialism, you know, be it racial essentialism, political essentialism, ratio political essentialism. I'm not a big fan of it, which is why my co-founders and I created Free Black Thought. It's a site that, you know, kind of showcases the diversity of viewpoint within, you know, the Black artist community, Black academics, Black activists, right? There is more than one way to be and think Black, I guess.
The major epiphany I had was that students, at least high school students, they really need to be taught how to have these conversations before you even have the conversations.
Something kind of similar to what Jessica was saying regarding having the students prepare to have effective conversation before they actually have the effective conversation. I believe we skip that often. And social and emotional learning in its original understanding addressed that. It overlaps with empowerment theory as well, in that, you know, it promotes self-awareness, right, and self-management, as well as social awareness, relationship management, and things like that. We're skipping the self-awareness and self-management. If we can do that and have students, you know, realize not just how to use rhetoric with other people, but to use rhetoric on themselves, what's called internal rhetoric. In fact, I have Jean Ninecamp's book right here. It's a thing, I'm not making it up. Internal rhetoric or interpersonal rhetoric, we can better instill the emotional fortitude and secure base necessary to enter into conversations with an open mind, instead of protecting yourself, you know, from the get-go. Hearing horror stories from various people, people I know, people who email me, people who ask me to come to their institutions and talk. There's one right answer you can come to, right? And all the other ones are signs of your complicity in white superiority or something like that.
Try to build a campaign for this kind of discussion. The point that a student of mine raised about 10 years ago, responding to something I wrote, was there's no interest group called People for Debating the Other Side in schools, right? That's generally not why people enter these political arenas. They enter because they want their point of view privileged, right? You don't see somebody out there on the barricades going, you know, more nuance, more nuance. But that doesn't really fit on a poster. But there are people, and they're on this call, who actually want that. And I think the next step is indeed trying to organize that movement.
When I promote viewpoint diversity, I am not saying that all viewpoints are equal. I'm not doing that. What I'm doing is saying with viewpoint diversity, those viewpoints can be on the table and we can discuss or debate, their efficacy. We can't do that if we're only allowing one viewpoint. So when we talk about free Black thought and the compendium and viewpoint diversity, I am not saying, all thoughts and ideologies are created equal. Not doing that. I am saying that we should be able to talk about all ideologies. But I would like to see it modeled, right? More events where people with opposing views have civil, real and authentic conversations about their viewpoints and go back and forth and not just make their case, but, strong manning the other side in a sense by respecting them enough to listen to them and try to find some common ground if there is any at all. I think we're not seeing that, right? The students aren't seeing that. And I think we need to model how that can look and how that can be.
My fellow liberal Democrats, some of them have not done themselves proud on these grounds, and they've got to speak up for the sort of dialogue and the sort of value that we're describing here. One of the most frustrating things to me about our political landscape is the kind of exchange we're discussing here, and free speech in general in many liberal communities now has been coded as something that's right-wing or conservative. And, the last book that I wrote about free speech, which is with Sidney Wilkinson, the cartoonist, was just an effort to remind people about, indeed, the radical roots of free speech in this country. That every great warrior for this thing we call social justice, like, I don't know, Frederick Douglass or Susan B. Anthony or Eugene V. Debs or Martin Luther King, they were all tribunes for free speech and dialogue, because they understood that if you cut that off, you're going to cut them off, and they can't make the case against the circumstances that they found. But unfortunately, I think in many precincts of the left, people have forgotten that, or they're just running scared. And I'm like, person up, my fellow lefties, person up. What are your curriculum suggestions and practical advice for other teachers for promoting viewpoint diversity or heterodox perspectives, critical thinking, and or art education? So Sam, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. So much of what I'm going to talk about is I will be referring you to our website, Heterodox Academy's website. We have a lot of tools and resources for K through 12 educators, including classroom activities, as well as a high school classroom activity series. So how would you use all of the tools and resources we have available? So I'm going to speak from that perspective. And honestly, I'm going to echo a lot of what was talked about in the first panel. So one of the things I think is most important is to set the conditions in the classroom where viewpoint diversity is going to be welcomed, and people aren't going to, or your students are not going to get into fights and arguments and try to shut each other down. And that's really starting by your students getting to know each other on a personal level. So having more, time for them to get to know each other. They may already know each other depending on, how your school is structured. But I think that's really important that they develop that interpersonal relationship, as well as a relationship with you, so it feels like an environment where even if people disagree with them, that they're not going to leave feeling ostracized or upset by what someone has said to them. And then, also kind of the self-awareness side of things. So exploring their own worldview. So doing activities that get them to think about why do they think about an issue in the way that they do. So how were they informed politically, religiously, what kind of neighborhood do they live in, what are their parents' background, whatever, all of the things that kind of shape your worldview, getting them to think about that and explore that so they understand where they're coming from before they enter into an activity that might have them think about diverse perspectives. And then really, and this is what our Heterodox Academy's high school classroom activity series does is it starts from that level, and then you can move into looking at different issues, the pros and cons of those issues, so engaging in dialectical thinking. And then as time progresses, then you can get into more of them presenting not only their viewpoint, but being charitable in how they represent the viewpoint of someone else. So kind of the idea of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. Why would someone think this way? And what is the best, form of their argument that you can articulate that they would agree with? So that's, kind of the trajectory that would get you to that point is starting with the relationships.
There are no right or wrong answers. There is no absolute truth except one's own deeply felt experience. There is always a risk and a fear of failure. There is always space for change and a hope to embrace. While recording my observations and experiencing Goya's work, I came to realize that art, music, as well as life itself, cannot be imprisoned in a fancy box of canned ideas and rigid concepts, even if they seem to be convincingly right. So the only conclusion I have is that there are no final conclusions to be made. This is why this project does not aim to become a finished product, but rather a study in progress. I hope this program allows you to launch your own personal journey of questioning, evoking your imagination, facing your fears. In other words, on exploring what it means to be you.
In my view, it's made up of three things. It's really self-awareness and awareness of other people. It's intellectual humility, which I believe is really the crux of viewpoint diversity. And then it's, I said it's actively seeking out other side arguments, which came from John Barron, who's also at Penn, and that's really his model. So as a teacher, it's like, okay, well, maybe I already know that to be a truly inclusive school, we have to include diversity of thought and diverse viewpoints. But how do we do that practically, right? And what does that look like? And most teachers will say, I can't take any more time out of what I'm doing to do this other thing. And so my thoughts have really shifted quite a bit since I started the work in 2016. And I now really describe viewpoint diversity as a practice and not a program. And I think that's actually the proper way to look at it. It's really not something that you can add on to a class, in any meaningful way. As you know, the retention may be there for a little while, but then it's going to go away like any one-off diversity training, right? So it's really about cultural change more than it is curricular change, which I think is a relief, quite frankly, to many teachers who can't figure out how to fit anything else in, where they're already stretched to the max. So I look at viewpoint diversity as a framework for education, a way to put inquiry over advocacy, a way to create a shared language that just to build on what Samantha was saying, this idea of, really getting people to feel comfortable, to be able to talk about their views, because when we close the doors on those views, they don't go away. It's not like, it's not like people aren't expressing themselves in the realms where they feel comfortable. And frankly, minds don't get changed. But viewpoint diversity really isn't about changing minds. And I think that's really important to keep up front. It's really about giving ourselves some space to try to understand perspectives that differ from our own. And quite frankly, it's really, really hard to do. So the way I do it, to kind of get to the answer, I came up with a system that's really practical for teachers. It's on the poster in my classroom, and it's the check method. So it's basically like, if you have a feeling of certainty, you've got to check yourself. And you start with the C, and then the H is for humility, right? And that reminds us that we've been wrong before. And then the E is for evidence. Can we seek out, can we go beyond our own personal experience to consider if perhaps complete? We know it's not, but we don't act that way. And then C, and this is where I really like to get into this work, is having constructive conversations, right? And how do we do that? And then even if that conversation fails, you still get the K, which is the knowledge. And you walk away, hopefully, a little more understanding than you were before, or at least with a broadened perspective. The funny thing about people is that we all think we're pretty open-minded, but not so. And so I think, you know, keeping that up front is important. And for kids, for a curricular idea, I would definitely, if I were homeschooling, I would use current events and try to make sure you're using some kind of media bias checker, or look at all sides. I think it's a fascinating thing just to look at how the right and the left report, right? So maybe doing depending on the age of the kid, obviously, but doing some comparative analysis there, so that I think students are, craving to know that there's more than one way to see things. I think in many ways that's a relief, because it's hard to always fall in line. And I think that really the whole issue that's happening now comes more from this great desire to belong than it does from any malicious, dark place. I think that people really do want to belong and understand, but somehow we've stepped away from the tools. So when you talk about viewpoint diversity like that, it makes perfect sense that it should be a diversity initiative that schools are involved in. It does not detract from other diversity initiatives, and I will probably die fighting that claim. But I really believe that what it does is it's the gateway diversity. It paves a path to have constructive conversations about difficult topics, which is what the work of diversity work does. So, so to be truly inclusive, I think that's what we have to
just to implement in new institutions that I hope will be formed soon. It's a history of collective psychosis and how we work with it, recognizing it and not fall into it. What's the antidote? What was my antidote? Finding something real. And I think we lose connection with the real. We have to reconnect with the real. What's real? For me, the real, it's a real conversation with real people, with real great minds of the past, with great music, with the beauty. Open eyes to the beauty that is already there in the world, because art, and that's what art does. It's a medium that helps us to restore world from its brokenness, we're incredibly broken, we're all fragmented, and some sort of restoration, that's what art does, we all need. No wonder majority of my students, if I ask them, why you do why you play piano, they say, it keeps us sane.
I would echo some of the things that Erin said, particularly like getting out into the community, team sports, things like that, free play, just kids playing with each other without, the authority of parents being around. That's where they learn to hash out their differences, create rules for games, whatever it is that they have to communicate with each other, and that an adult is not going to solve the problem for them. And then I'd also say, I'm a big reader. I love good stories. And so I think that's important too. Just reading books from a diverse range of authors that are from different regions of the country, regions of the world, have different backgrounds and perspectives, but good books, make sure they're reading the really high quality good books, because I think stories, they take you out of your place and put you in somebody else's place, and that can be really helpful.
Sure.
I'm Israeli citizen. I'm a wandering Jew, I call myself, a wandering Jew who wanders, trying to figure things out, which I haven't yet. So I have a lot of friends who are Muslims, right? And we supposedly have to be enemies, right? And guess what? We start from the point where we are at, from the point, what is it we share? We share our love of hummus. So we start from hummus. We don't start from diversity of our views. We start from, okay, what we share. And I think we should start looking for those points of connections that we share, which call our shared humanity, right? Where they are. and maybe
Right.
go down to earth more.
Hi, I'm Gerst, founder of the Educational Liberty Alliance. We are dedicated to helping people organize and push for diversity of thought in K-12 schools. Along the lines of Eric's comments from the first panel, we're going to try to model a discussion with opposing viewpoints, which hopefully will provide insight into the issue that we are discussing. Our topic, as Ilana said, is whether teachers should advocate for social justice in the K-12 classroom. Traditionalists instinctively say no, while those of a more progressive bent are often in favor of it. What are some examples of social justice causes you've seen advocated for in the classroom? And how would you characterize what that something is that social justice is trying to achieve?
We studied some of the more traditional forms of migration of peoples that we think about, migrating from one country to another, but we also focused on forms of migration that were maybe more familiar and more current to some of my students living in Brooklyn. And so one of the things that we talked about was gentrification. And through focusing on gentrification, we were able to focus more broadly and explore more broadly other forms of displacement. And so one social justice issue that we were able to grapple with then was the social justice issue of forced displacement. And I think that the goal of focusing on that and discussing that with my students as it relates to social justice is making sure that students understand aspects and elements of fairness, aspects and elements of inclusion and belonging. And there's a lot of other sort of tentacles that has, but to be succinct, that's what I'd say as an example from my classroom.
Kind of the common characteristic. What is the, as I originally framed it, what is that something? We talk about social justice being advocating for changes to laws and policies, but what's the ultimate goal?
In my view, I think the ultimate goal of advocating for social justice is to create a society in which we are not only bringing people in from the margins, but we're also expanding the center and making a society that is more representative, reflective, and inclusive of all people, but especially for those who have traditionally been on the margins.
Tony, let's get your perspective of what are some examples that you've seen in the classroom or read about, and how would you characterize the something that these social justice causes are trying to achieve generally?
So in the last 5 to 10 years, these have come under certain kinds of frameworks like the importance of incorporating slavery reparations, free public housing, racial and gender quotas, as Garry stated, gentrification and collective financial issues, calling for the abolition of Western civilization principles under the guise of decentralizing whiteness, promoting Black Lives Matter protests and riots, adhering to the 1619 Project, hypersexualized education in elementary classrooms, and issues suggesting that national and global problems lay at the feet of a specific racial and sexual group. And the reason that I would characterize all of those as social justice issues is because this something to achieve in social justice is all built around closing perceived gaps in outcomes that have to be caused by harmful actions of another group, often with little statistical data proof other than that the gap exists, therefore there must be some type of malicious intent and action. That's why it's social justice and not advocating specifically for justice. Advocating for justice means every individual is treated equally and fairly under the law, whereas social justice says that's not getting the job done. And so therefore we have to advocate for other means in order to solve those societal issues that we see present via historical or present collective gaps.
If we give teachers and administrators license to advocate for social justice, it would seem to give them the ability to select which causes they deem appropriate. Is that discretion concerning, or do we trust our educators to make those decisions about which causes to advocate?
The key issue here to consider is that really who's swinging the bat of deciding what issues to discuss is incredibly important to discuss. I don't really want someone with my complete opposite political views telling my child how they should think or feel about certain issues, and vice versa. Someone who has completely opposite political views from me probably doesn't want me giving all of my students my unique perspective on history and all of the opinions that come with it. And that's really key to this conversation. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, is that anytime we give someone power to do something, once the power changes hands to someone who I may disagree with, that becomes a key issue.
I think what's really important in the way that I see it is that there are groups of people, many of whom, I mean, all of whom, because schools are one of the only compulsory institutions that we have in our society, we see our students represent everyone, right? And because of that, it's important for us to make sure that in the classroom, we are recognizing all of our students' humanity. And part of that involves, I think, condemning certain things and making sure that certain things are not on the table.
What we think K through 12 education should be trying to foster and develop in students.
So I think a lot of what I view as social justice in the classroom sort of revolves around my stipulation that good educators and good education helps prepare students to repair the world and bring it closer to what ideally we would like for it to be, sort of, in a normative sense.
Teaching students a series of values without a comprehensive tool belt of skills and virtue cripples the student post-graduation. So we see this really with a lot of Chicago and LA graduates right now, who statistically really don't have an ability to read past a second grade level, but could tell you many aspects of social emotional learning. So how are they supposed to keep a job and rear a family? And this really correlates to what Garry is saying as far as repairing the world. I would question the authority of really anyone in education to define certain issues that need to be brought to the table. And really in recognizing historical gaps and what the solutions are to those gaps. As a teacher, it's very easy for me to select which information I want my students to see regarding repairing certain historical situations or gaps in general. Therefore, it's really incredibly important that when I'm talking about the value of education, that it's done through the objective lens that, as Garry said, students have to become better people and they have to go out and they have to make the society a better place. I think that it's perhaps just a little more centered on kind of the classical Western civilization ideas and values of individualism.
How do we determine, particularly in our current society where different people, I think, probably have different value systems, how do we determine which values the school should be using in the school system? Who should be making that determination?
Or I really would suggest kind of a minimalist approach to how the state is teaching values, encouraging things like family and the home, make sure that we're keeping our parents really at the top as far as teaching values to our students. Now, of course, that's not going to completely cut it. Education doesn't come without virtue. It doesn't come without an understanding of beauty and value. I would suggest that there are some values that are objectively better than others. And within that, within the last 10 years or so, we've seen quite a divergence in education in K through 12. We've seen a suggestion that one of the best ways to go about life is with an extreme adherence to the collective, to the group, and that all of your virtues and all of your sins come from that identity. And I disagree. I think that's objectively a worse way to go about teaching a student rather than focusing on individualism, which Western civilization was built upon and thrived through.
I think that schools should be fostering values in students. I think where I diverge from Tony's perspective is that I think I'm kind of on the other end of things. I think while there's an importance in focusing on individualism as well, I think that the collective should be the priority. We hear the terms equality and equity kind of brought into conversations a lot. I think that equity the way that I think of equity is not necessarily giving everyone the same thing, but giving different demographics what it is that they need to fulfill their purpose or maybe a broader collective purpose. And I think that that is one of the values that in a lot of my work, I propone and promote. And then that's one of the values that I try to work through with my students a lot when I was in the classroom as well.
We're talking about values in the schools, and we also want to encourage independent thought. Is there any potential conflict there? I mean, are we encouraging students to make their own decisions about what values they want to incorporate into their own lives?
I think we can show them through the selection of materials and resources what sort of placing some values over others, how that's resulted for certain people throughout history. But I think that to tell them that this value is what they must, is the one that they must hold dear, might be a little outside of our purview.
I'm more than happy with presenting students with a very fact-based view of history and then letting them derive the values that they see from it. I have no problem with showing my students, you know, the horrors of Nazi Germany and what that ideology did, and also the horrors of communism and what that ideology did, and the millions that both ideologies left dead. I would caution the idea of just giving students kind of a smorgasbord of values and then saying, go pick one. They're kids, and kids have pretty poor judgment. I really enjoy getting to work with a lot of kids who want candy all the time. And I'm sure that we could give students candy for dinner and say that certain value systems, you pick which one you want. Obviously, the kid's going to go eat the candy. That doesn't necessarily mean it's best for them. I do think there are some value systems that are objectively better than others. And by objectively, I mean that can fit into instructional time. Objective values that at the end of the day do not encroach on the rights of a person.
It is important for us to sort of lay out for students the benefits or maybe drawbacks of different value systems.
Sure.
As you know, as evidenced by different, you know, events in history. And I think that we're in agreement there. I'd like to hear more a little bit about what you said about helping students understand that there are some value systems that are objectively better, because I actually really agreed with that. And I'm wondering, it feels maybe slightly contradictory to some of the other things that you voiced earlier.
Yeah,
Can we good? Yeah, absolutely. So when I suggest that we should be teaching that some value systems are objectively better, I am talking about the fundamentals that built Western civilization. I am suggesting that the Western civilization that focused primarily on the foundations of justice, pure and simple with no additives, that's really what I'm focusing on, and finding that through the beauty of the arts. You're never going to get education to a space where it can be completely unbiased. It can't happen. There is no law that we can pass. There are no amount of cameras in classrooms that are going to keep every teacher so obsessively neutral that they're not going to get any moral value system from that class.
Is enlisting students, and Garry, maybe this gets to your comment earlier about repairing the world, so I'll start with you. Is enlisting students an appropriate way to get those changes made?
I think it depends on what you mean by enlisting. I think bringing students into some of those discussions is a really important step for us to take. I'd like to think that it's important for us to help get students on board in terms of what it might look like to repair our society and to make it more inclusive, to make it a better society. I take a little bit less issue with involving students in maybe specific causes around social justice, because I think, Tony, you and I might disagree on the idea of neutrality. And I think that there is not necessary. I think that neutral space is a lot smaller than we tend to think it is. And so I think that by remaining silent or leaving certain things outside of the classroom space, what we're not exercising is neutrality. What we're exercising is sort of the status quo or maintenance, especially when we're talking about social justice.
The last thing you said, really interesting, and the idea that silence and what can be kept out of classroom discussion could be considered as bias towards that event. I would caution that providing a certain emotionally charged topic to the classroom for my students to kind of be whipped up into a frenzy, as students are wont to do, is a very dangerous thing. And putting my students in an environment where I tell them that it's good for them to discuss things and get, you know, in a lot of cases, as we've seen in a lot of these social justice advocacy cases, students are encouraged to discuss the topic, to kind of whip themselves up into a frenzy. And then you have this very strange mob-esque mentality in the classroom. So in two schools pop into my mind, one in Manhattan and one in Philadelphia, in which they were talking about a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and kind of the things that played into the death of George Floyd. And within this classroom setting, there were students in both classrooms who dissented, who didn't agree, who didn't like where this was going. And the other students in the classroom ended up shouting these particular students down until they were forced to admit that they agreed with the majority.
I kind of agree with you, Tony. These conversations are important, but they do kind of, they work students up. And I think part of what we can do is minimize the working up that happens in these conversations and encourage students to move to action. What those actions are things that we can sort of guide and we can help students with. It would almost be disingenuous for them to not want to take action if we're, you know, sort of reviewing things that have happened in history, are currently happening to them and their classmates, to just kind of intellectualize it and then leave it, you know, and stop there. I think that might be a little bit, that might be too much for me to do as an educator. I'll just say that.
So I just want to respond in two quick things here. So first of all, I am absolutely all for encouraging empathy. We holistically agree on that. I have wholeheartedly agree on that. I'm all for making sure that my students understand that based on the set of shoes you're wearing, things can be very different, and we need to understand people are coming from very different backgrounds with very different experiences. Where that ends for me is suggesting that as a collective group and a society group, because someone is coming from a place of perhaps some kind of trouble, some historical lack, just to put a word there to kind of illustrate the negative, that someone is at fault. I think there's a big difference between teaching empathy and then teaching there is empathy that requires someone else to kind of make allocations kind of against their right.
I didn't take that, I did not mean by that there should be some things that we don't discuss at all. I think what I meant by that was that there are some things that in our discussions, teachers can and should condemn.
So depending on your spot on the political compass, that's going to look different. It's like, you know, if we're just going to go ahead and pick right out of the bucket, like the trans issue in elementary education is really big at the moment. You might have one teacher that thinks that the transgender argument in elementary is tantamount to child abuse, where someone on the other side might suggest that it's incredibly important that trans children at that age are included and represented well. And by included, I mean that those certain actions and things that they're going through are rationalized and made normal. And I just want to clarify that as a teacher, me deciding what should or shouldn't be universally condemned on that intense of a political topic could get dangerous at some point.
And I don't think that my suggestion that there should be some things that are universally condemnable, I did not mean in that to say that each teacher should decide for themselves what those things are.
If one believes that either social justice advocacy in the classroom is improper in any way, shape, or form, or one believes that involving students in social justice causes in some sense is okay, but there are guidelines, what do we need to do in the schools administratively? What can the schools do either to prevent it altogether, given the discretion teachers have in their own classrooms, or to control it so that it's something that's acceptable? Garry, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we can do is we can move towards preparing teachers and developing teachers to facilitate these conversations in ways that don't become, you know, so that they don't become huge conflagrations, right? The other thing that I think we can do is we can begin to sort of weave in standards that help build certain competencies in our students that would bring about social justice. Even if that doesn't necessarily mean we're directly engaging in social justice outright all the time. So for instance, I believe the new name is Learning for Justice, formerly Teaching Tolerance, has a list of standards that are around, you know, inclusion, social justice, and the like.
I would really encourage, since we're talking about advice to administrations, I would encourage administrators to kind of take a second look at how they're handling professional developments and classrooms within staff meetings. It's become a really common policy to suggest that there are voices that you want people to speak up, but then when those voices speak up, the answers that are given are very dismissive and one-off. I see this in a lot of things like racial equity trainings and things like this. And I really would encourage that if we're to bring open discussion about complicated issues such as, social justice in the classroom, we first have to make sure that our teachers are modeling the same thing, which means being able to foster an environment where the teachers in your school are allowed to openly disagree with things without, suggesting that they keep quiet, which is something that we do see in a lot of public schools. There have been a lot of emails and conversations between principals and teachers, dozens that I've spoken to in the last couple of months, who were told to keep quiet when they disagreed. And I think that for the sake of ideological diversity in general, especially regarding how we're going to model this ideological diversity to our students, it's important that we make sure our teachers know that regardless of their opinion, they're not just supposed to sit in staff meetings and be quiet.
I mean, I've taught in an ed school as a PhD student. My training is in a school of education. And I think often viewpoint diversity is not even modeled there, so there's this one way to teach social studies. There's this one way to teach English language arts. And so I think, and that's just like a cycle that perpetuates.
I think the thing that that we should maybe consider is educational leadership training, which is very popular. And that is where people go back to school. And then there's this whole context of, when you go to educational leadership school to get your doctorate or whatever you're doing, then you're, I think, in a different position where you are imposing things, I guess, theoretically to get your school ahead or up to par with other competition. And I think that is actually a bit of a threat. And those do tend to be very liberal leaning programs, no question.
What is a legitimate controversy as opposed to an illegitimate one? And what's an appropriate controversy to entertain in schools as opposed to an inappropriate one? Right. And what we came up with, for whatever it's worth, is that an appropriate controversy is one where highly informed people disagree.
I think, Jonathan, your test, while it sounds nice, is extremely problematic because a lot of the people right today who want to shut down debate believe that any opinion of that is contrary to theirs is not well informed. And so they could try to use your test and still shut down debate because they believe that anything that disagrees with them is ill-informed. If in fact, the one position is so easily disproven, then John Stuart Mill would say all the more reason to put it out there, because then we need to disprove it. Because if we silence it, people will continue to believe it.
I think that this is really not to make something sound easier than it really is a more nuanced, difficult thing to approach. Whenever I had students that would posit things that I disagreed with, especially concerning all of the ins and outs of science education in my biology classroom, I would simply respond with data. I would respond with evidence. I would say this piece of evidence disagrees with that. And if they say, well, I know this other piece of evidence, I have a choice. I can take that piece of evidence. I can look at that piece of evidence. I can say, I will look at that piece of evidence. I don't know how valid it is yet. Or I can simply introduce my student to the concept that there's a lot of data out there. And if I glue these numbers together in this way, I can make correlation look a lot like causation. Like the pro-life issue or evolutionism versus creationism comes up a lot. And really it's about sharing data and making sure the kids have the tools they need to make an informed decision.
I have seen in the chat a lot about social emotional learning as a gateway for CRT. And I know that that's something that people are talking about, but I'm going to say something that maybe a lot of people won't like, which is I think SEL is really important. I think it's actually important to the work of viewpoint diversity because if you don't have self-awareness, which is really the work that social emotional learning does, you can't really extend that awareness to other people.
Response, Erin. I really like all of the values that you suggested and things that we should be teaching kids to do. I do not believe that's what social emotional learning has become in this country in a very broader context, especially considering organizations like CASEL in the last decade. So there's the idea of teaching students to pause and reflect. And then there are the ideas of teaching students that what they feel, no matter what, is valid. Those are two completely different things, but they've both come under the banner of a lot of organizations touting social emotional learning. So to clarify, I don't know if I can universally get on board with saying that social emotional learning is a great thing, and it can be a gateway to CRT That's a valid criticism because it does set up the importance of an intersectional hierarchy. And especially through CASTLE and a lot of the Indiana groups that I've talked to with a lot of the regards to SEL, that definitely comes through.
In December, CASTLE, the primary organization, I guess, for social emotional learning, came out and embraced this idea of transformative social emotional learning, which is the variation of social emotional learning that is problematic, that people are associated with CRT. That is not the way it's supposed to go. The way it's supposed to go is more in line with what Erin was talking about, is more in line with what used to be called emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management, and all the competencies therein. These are good things. SEL is supposed to give students the ability to handle being wrong, the ability to handle somebody else's different viewpoint.
There are laws that are trying to control pedagogy in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and other state houses. I think the biggest assault against free thought is Republicans playing to their base for political advantage. Does any other sect/group try to control others and their thoughts and exposure through laws? One of the biggest is the assault against critical race theory, which isn't being taught in K through 12, but state houses have decided that it shouldn't be taught, even though it's not.
First of all, according to Gloria Ladson-Billings and many of the other foundational scholars of critical race theory, it absolutely is being taught in K through 12 education as a practice, not as the law theory in and of itself. That's an important distinction to make. As far as the left and the right passing legislation to mandate behavior, that's happening everywhere right now, whether we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about critical race theory legislation in state houses. Whenever you mandate a behavior, people don't like it.
I'm literally looking at books that say that CRT is in high schools. It is in high schools. It's not subject matter. No fifth grader is reading Derek Bell, all right? They're not reading Richard Delgado. Their teachers have, and they are putting it into schools as praxis, right? They are shaping their teaching around the theory, around CRT. That's how it's in schools.